So as early as the 2nd century, a Roman poet called Juvenal coined the term of a black swan to mean something that just doesn't exist. In the 16th century, this became a very common expression in Europe to mean a state of impossibility. And the reason was very obvious, because all historical records in Europe had shown that they had white feathers. So it was only at the end of the 17th century when the Dutch explorer Willem de Vlaming, as the first European, spotted black swans in Western Australia, where they're actually very common. So this turned black swans into something that may be perceived as highly unlikely before it actually happens, simply because everything we thought we know about the world has never failed us up until this point. So it shows how fragile our thought systems are when we think about the future, even if these thoughts are backed up by some solid science. So what do we do if we still want to determine what unlikely events we may need to plan for in the future? We often refer to things like forecasts, quite often made by experts in their respective fields. So for instance, international politics or financial systems. A researcher at UC Berkeley, Philip Tedlock, followed up on experts' long-term predictions on what is going to happen in the future. And what he found was quite disillusioning. He found that experts are not significantly more reliable than non-experts in guessing what is going to happen in the future. So in other words, people who spend their lives studying the state of the world are poorer forecasters than some dart-throwing monkeys. So this is the world we live in at the moment. We've never had so much knowledge and data like we have today, and still it feels like our future becomes ever more unpredictable. My name is Ricarda Schimdt-Scheele. I'm a social scientist, and for the past years I've been particularly interested in the future. So not in the future per se, but in how projections and scenarios about the future impact our perspectives and our behaviors in the present. So in our society today, it almost becomes a necessity to consider the future and its possible developments. So for instance, businesses do it, organizations do it, but also governments look into the future when they assess the viability of some policy decisions. And we as individuals do it as well when we look into the future of our careers, our education, and our personal life. So a very particular aspect of looking into the future is to do scenario planning. And what I did in my research is that I looked at how do we perceive different scenarios about the future? What makes them plausible for us and what makes them implausible? And why do we consider some scenarios as possible and completely disregard others? So what I would like to share with you today is first, how do our worldviews and our perspectives about the world shape how we think about the future? And second, how can scenario planning shape and help us understand the future better? So let me start with explaining what does it mean to use forecasts and what are the consequences of doing it. So long-term developments are very regularly being predicted using techniques of forecasting. This may be the case for the energy supply and demand, for weather and climate events, but also for things like water consumption. And this is what they did in Germany in the 70s and 80s to predict the water consumption of private households for the new century. And like with many forecasts, we can see that retrospectively, they horribly failed doing this. So in this chart here, you can see the upper three lines as three different forecasts about the future, while the blue line represents the actual consumption in Germany. So there are many different aspects that these forecasts failed to consider. For instance, the development of efficiency measures and technologies, our leisure behavior, the increase in single households, but also our increased awareness towards saving energy and saving water. And there's also one particularly interesting aspect about it. These major forecast studies looked at the US as the pattern of reference. So with increased salaries and increased living conditions in Germany, they assumed that they would just continue in the same way as the US did. So what they basically did is that they used the context of a different country and different people and applied it. And these forecasts have major repercussions up until today. So the pipe networks that were built by planners based on these forecasts were turned out to be overdimensioned. So in many rural areas in Germany, there's not enough water flowing through the pipes, and additional water needs to be pumped through just to keep them operationalized. So my point here is not to be picky about events that are much more understandable from today's perspective, but really to get a sense of why it is so difficult to imagine a future that is different from what we know today. And it also shows us how important it is to question and to clarify some hidden assumptions that go into a lot of work and thinking about the future. And this is what scenario planning can do compared to forecasting. So what are the environments that we find ourselves in when scenario planning is most helpful and most needed for you or for your organization or for your business? These environments are characterized by what strategists often call tuna conditions. So this has nothing to do with the fish, but it means to characterize the environment by T, which stands for turbulence. So this is the pace and the capacity and the complexity of the future that might sometimes overwhelms us in our capacity to really adjust to situations. We also have a high degree of uncertainties, and uncertainties are very different from risks because they cannot be calculated or measured. They can simply be imagined. We also have a high degree of novelty. This means that it's very difficult for us to imagine or even express something that has never happened before, that it's just unprecedented. And finally, the future is also very ambiguous. So we cannot say whether current or future events may have positive or negative implications for our future. So in these environments, what do scenarios do differently compared to forecasts? There's a fundamentally different logic between scenario planning and forecasting. With forecasting, we imagine one single future and we derive this as a clear pathway from the present into the future. With scenario planning, however, we do not even try to predict the future. Because from our today's perspective, the future isn't singular. We as humans use mental models to inform how we think. And so we also have different assumptions about what we think happens in the present and what matters most for us in the future. So this means that we also from there derive alternative futures that we can think of. So with scenario planning, we ask what could plausibly happen in the future. So instead of extrapolating the present, we simulate alternative futures and we think, how would these futures look like and how would these futures feel like? But the primary point with scenario planning is not so much to take these futures and look into the futures, but to use these alternative futures and look back from them into the present. So we ask ourselves, given that all these different scenarios could become a future reality, what does this say about our present situation? How can we act now? And what should we do differently now? So how can scenarios really change the way we think about the future? Herman Kahn was one of the strategists at the RAND Corporation who established scenario planning during the Cold War. And he said, any particular scenario should contain some paranoid ideas, but these ideas must be judged on the basis of plausibility, which is oftentimes a very difficult assessment. So the focus of scenario planning is not on the futures that are most probable, because we cannot even say what's probable about the future anyway, but what is plausible. And this means we imagine different futures that may seem unlikely because they challenge some implicitly held assumptions about what we previously thought about the world. But with these scenarios, we can still understand why, how, and under what conditions these scenarios could become a future reality. So this is easier said than done, because in order for scenarios to effectively widen our perspectives about the future, they need to overcome some kind of very sticky worldviews of ours. So in my research, I conducted different experiments to find out how do we assess scenarios and what makes them plausible for us. And I found the following tendencies. When we hear scenarios from others, we tend to judge these futures based on whether we trust the people that tell us the stories and whether we trust the method behind the building process of the scenarios. So in my study, I had a lot of participants replying, I don't really understand the scenario, but it looks really professional and credible to me, so I think it's plausible. Also, when we have narratives as scenarios, we tend to judge them based on whether the plot of the narrative corresponds to what we believe are the key principles of our society and the key norms of how our society should work. So for instance, I confronted participants with different scenarios about the energy transition in Germany. And what I found was that people tended to only judge those scenarios as plausible that pictured the transition as being successful through the right market incentives, through planning security for businesses, so really economy-driven factors, and not so much through citizen initiatives or through a changed perspective and attitude towards energy in the society. Whether or not we find scenarios and futures plausible also depends on whether they correspond with our own expectations and our own beliefs about the future. So for instance, people who prior to my experiments told me that they find the transition, the energy transition, to be unnecessary, they also tended to disregard any scenario about the future in which the transition was pictured as being successful. And finally, also some personality traits of ours do play an important role. So for instance, participants who told me that they have difficulties to keep problems open-ended and who seek solutions sooner rather than later, they also tended to judge the scenarios in the extremes. So either very plausible or very unplausible. So what could we do to still help scenario planning widen our perspectives about the future? First, keep in mind that scenarios are not just knowledge products that you produce and leave on the shelf. Scenarios are most helpful if you use them to start a conversation about the future with other people. So try to include as many voices as possible if you try to look into the future of your business or your organization. Different people find different aspects plausible and implausible. And so talking to them significantly opens up your perspectives about the future. And this is also because the future, from our today's perspective, is never really stable, but it's always in flux. So scenarios that you may think were implausible yesterday may be plausible today and vice versa. The second thing is to use systems diagrams to illustrate how you think about the future. So in science, when we want to arrive at some solid research findings, we tend to rely on past and present data and on valid observations. This is not really possible when we look into this in the future, because history does not provide us with any point of reference that we could learn from. So what I found in my research is that people tended to look for any kind of evidence when they look into the future. And I found that numbers can be very alluring and give us the impression of certainty about the future, which we in fact do not have when we talk about uncertain futures. So what I propose to do instead is to do systems diagrams of your scenario to articulate how your scenarios work causally. What is the logic behind the scenarios? And you will be able to come up with scenarios that you may not even think about prior to doing the systems math. And the third thing is to use stories. When we hear stories, we do not only imagine them as more real than by reading just unrelated data, we also get emotionally and physically more involved. So there's this interesting research from the University of Oxford in which researchers asked participants to imagine bright and dark objects. And what they found was that the pupils dilated when people thought about dark objects, and they contracted when they thought about bright objects. So the very same result that would have been expected if they would look at the real objects. So this is just to illustrate that imagining something can trigger something very real in us and can be very powerful. I would like to close here with a thought experiment for you. So imagine for a moment that we're not in the fall of 2020, but in the fall of 2019. And in my talk, I would ask you, What do you think are the key social and political challenges that will shape the coming years of our society? And one of your fellow students would come up with a future in which a virus that originated in animals spreads from one country to another, infects millions of people, kills over 1 million people worldwide, and causes an economic collapse and social distress for so many people. So I can imagine that your initial reaction or your gut feeling, just like mine, would have told you that this is very unlikely, if not absurd. So it's of course easy to retrospectively say that our today's pandemic could have been anticipated and did not come as a surprise, as some would say. But this is not the point that I want to make here. My point is that when our assessments of futures are guided by what is most probable, we may have come up with this scenario, but we probably would have dismissed it back in 2019 just because there were other futures that we perceived as more likely and more obvious, and we would have turned to them. However, with scenario planning would have invited us to a more forward-thinking approach. So we'd actively look for things that are novel and that are uncertain, so for breaks between the present and the future. And we wouldn't do this just by making things up, but rather by testing and revealing assumptions that we may not even consider so uncertain and so problematic in the first place. So applied to the example of COVID-19, there were key uncertainty factors known in 2019 that were contributing to today's pandemic, and questioning their interaction could have potentially led to a plausible scenario. So for instance, there was a known increase in coronaviruses, particularly in China. We had a networked world with a lot of travel, both leisure and business. We had a lot of people living in big cities very closely together. And for many countries, we have a healthcare system that was not prepared for such a demand of sick people. So the question that I want to leave you with today is not how can we predict or know the future, but how can we widen our perspectives to what the future might hold in order to see and re-perceive our present situation and learn from this for a better tomorrow. Thank you very much for listening.